Well, it's my great pleasure to be here with you this morning to talk about a subject of such timely relevance for those of us that are engaged in the battle for the Christian family and the battle over ideas in the 21st century. And our topic for this morning is Jerusalem and Athens, antithesis between Hebrew and Greek culture. And while I will be speaking about Hebrew culture generally, the emphasis of this morning's message will be a dissection of, or an autopsy, shall we say, of Greek philosophy, attitudes, and actions. Now one might ask, why, more than 2,000 years after the death of classical and Hellenistic Greece, would Christians be concerned about performing an autopsy on people who are no longer here with us, who have left the world, and whose society is really well represented by the image you see on the screen? It no longer exists. Yes, there is a Greek culture, but it's vastly different from the ancient Greeks of both the early period as well as the Hellenistic period and the classical period of Greece, all of which I'll try to define for you. Why would we do that? And the answer is that man has an uncanny way of reviving and of glorifying some of the worst elements of paganism past. In fact, I'd go a step further. The last 2,000 years have largely been a battle in the West between two competing worldviews and two competing philosophies. On the one hand, Hebraic biblical culture, which is with its presuppositions, and on the other hand, the Greco-Roman worldview, of which we will be emphasizing the Greco part of the Greco-Roman worldview today. Now, when you think of Greece, perhaps some of you think about things like this: the death of Socrates in 339 AD, which is beautifully depicted in this famous painting, which glorifies this gentleman in typical Greek form, I might add, with a perfect physique, though he was incredibly obese at the time of his death, and pointing him in heroic style, which is yet another icon of Greek theology, which we'll be speaking about, while his students about him are grieving as Socrates is about to take the hemlock, having been sentenced to death by the oligarchy which oversees his city-state of which he is a part. Perhaps some of you, when you think of Greece, think of the relationship with the Jews, and maybe you think of the revolt of the Maccabees that took place and of the tension that ultimately led to the creation of an independent Judea, which was a result of Antiochus Epiphanes' persecution of the Jewish people, which took place in the 2nd century BC. Or maybe some of you think about Greek sculpture and the Greek ideals, the heroic ideals, and the Greek forms which are represented in Greek sculpture. When I was a student at the College of William and Mary, I spent 2 years studying Greek sculpture and Greek architecture as part of classical studies department. And it's interesting to note that though the sculptors and the architects and the artisans that helped to design and craft classical Greek antiquity and all of its artistic representations, though they are dead more than 2 millennia, their styles remain the foundation of the Renaissance, the foundation of the rise of humanism, and have been widely incorporated into the neoclassical architectural styles and the federal period styles within American architecture. And so you can go to Washington, D.C., and you can see Greco-Roman concepts, Greco-Roman forms dominating Washington, D.C. May I point out to you, by the way, that those are not marks of the colonial or the revolutionary time period, but of a later time period that came in and specifically wanted to identify with Greece and Rome and sought to do that through the architecture. Maybe some of you think about this, you think about the architecture, and maybe you've walked down the street of your local neighborhood, and in your neighborhood you've looked at the First Baptist Church of whatever, and you've realized that it's designed after the Temple of Athena, or the Temple of Delphi, or one of the Greek temples which dominated the ancient world. And maybe somewhere along the line you scratched your head and you said to yourself, why would a Baptist church choose its design style after a pagan goddess temple? Maybe that thought never occurred to you before, but these are the kind of questions that I hope to raise today within the broader context of our discussion about Jerusalem and Athens. And so I bring you to this famous quote, which was offered by Tertullian. And we will begin with Tertullian today, and God willing, we will end with Tertullian today. And Tertullian asks this question. Remember, Tertullian comes around 200 AD, and when this great church father, and like all church fathers, Tertullian wasn't perfect. His theology was not perfect in every respect, but he was a great church father, and he was a defender of orthodoxy on so many different fronts, and we can rightly look to Tertullian as a great man of the faith defending biblical orthodoxy in the first 2 and 3 centuries of church history. He asks this question, and he does so as part of a larger polemic against the takeover of Hebrew Christian thinking and of modern Christian society by Hellenistic thought. And he asks the deafening question, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What indeed does Athens has to do with Jerusalem? Now, though Tertullian did not use the expression that Henry Van Til would coin in the 20th century, which is that culture is religion externalized, meaning that all cultures are the outward manifestation of the true faith assumptions of a people. So when you want to understand the religious beliefs of a people, you look at the culture. You say, what is their daily schedule like? What is family life like? What is their art like? What is their architecture like? What do they prioritize in terms of their culture? The things they prioritize are a reflection of their ideals and ultimately of their faiths. And so when Van Til said, culture is religion externalized, he was pointing back to a question that was raised by Tertullian. If, in fact, culture is religion externalized, if culture is not neutral, if philosophies, in fact, do represent religious worldviews, then why in the world do Christians in the New Testament era seek to go back to the paganism of the Athenians to build their world, to build their schools, and to build their cultures? And if you live in the year 2006, which is the time that this session is being presented here, then you know that for the vast majority of professing Christians in America today, this question has never been asked. In fact, the assumption that it's okay for our children of Jerusalem to go to the schools of Athens is something which is absolutely unquestioned within many circles today. And yet, there is tension within Christianity. Do we send the children of Jerusalem to the schools of Athens? Many of you in this room have asked that question. This is the question that has been asked for 2,000 years. This is the heart and the soul of the battle. It was the battle in the time of Aquinas. It was the battle in the time of Tertullian. It was the battle at the time of the Reformation. It was the battle at the times of the Scopes trial. And it is the battle today. And so it's important for us to go back in time and to understand a little bit more about these Greeks from whom we have inherited such an influential legacy, and to ask ourselves the question, is this a legacy that presuppositionally oriented Christians would seek to identify with? Now let's begin by mentioning the basic presupposition of classical Greek thinking. And if you were to reduce to a simple maxim the essence of classical Greek thinking, what did the Greeks think? It can be reduced to this basic statement: man is the measure of all things. Now herein you have the great battle between Jerusalem and Athens. You have it within this very statement here. Man is the measure of all things. Now this was a thought which worked in perfect harmony with the teachings of Plato, of Socrates, and of Aristotle. Because to the Greek philosophers whose theories and teachings would have a life that extended thousands of years after their death, the highest value, the highest court of appeal, the highest standard by which truth would be judged would be the mind of man. And so Socrates, in making his great apology and in the course of his battle for his very life as he's making his arguments, appeals to the autonomous reason of man and appeals to man as the ideal standard and as the ultimate standard by which all truth is to be judged. Even gods, even the gods, as the Greeks saw them, were part of nature, were under nature. They lived within the context of nature. In essence, they were really divinized men. They were glorified men, and we'll say more about that later on. But nature itself, this cosmos around us, and all that's part of it, the highest ideal within the context of this was the reason of man, the mind of man, and for this reason, the Greeks said, we want to do everything we can to raise up philosopher kings. And the idea of the philosopher king was central to Platonic thinking and was discussed in his book, The Republic. Because if we can train up truly liberated men who are liberated in their mind and who embraced this sort of Neoplatonic ideal of dualism, which told us that the bodies and the things of the earth were something we ultimately had to separate from because the ideal was the spirit and the mind. And so earth, physical things, bad, spiritual things, good. That if we could do this, then ultimately we could have a truly blessed and happy society. But this idea that man is the source of authority, man is the measurement of all things, stands in stark opposition to the Hebraic understanding of life. Under the Hebraic understanding of life, the revelation which the Hebrews had, who lived within the Greek culture, began with these devastating words. In the beginning, God. Perhaps the most devastating words of the entire Bible. Because the statement, in the beginning, God, is a declaration. It's a statement that there is no higher authority by which God can be judged. Not man, not man's mind, no external source. God is the measure of all things. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so the Scripture, which we look to, and the God of this Scripture is the standard. And in fact, if we were to reduce all philosophical questions of all time and all eternity to one simple question, that question would be, by what standard? By what standard do we measure things? By what standard do we judge things? By what standard do we know right from wrong? And so this being the case, right at the outset of our journey into our Hellenistic origins of Western civilization, to the extent that they were influenced by that, we need to see that the antithesis, with Christianity being the thesis and Greco-Roman paganism being the antithesis, that this tension between the two stands and falls on the question of authority. For the Hebrews, man was created in the image of God. Man was a sinner. Man was meant to follow the directives by faith, which was a rational faith in an objective God who had given a revelation. So there's no tension between faith and reason in the Hebraic mind. Interestingly enough, there is a tension between faith and reason in the Socratic mind. On the one hand, Socrates will make the case that we need to appeal to reason. Then on the other hand, when reason doesn't address issues, Socrates will directly go to mysticism and to feelings and to impressions. And this is the conflicted, dichotomous presentation of thinking that Socrates makes. But right here we see it. What's the standard? Is it God or is it man? And if you want to reduce Greek philosophy to that one expression, man is the measure of all things, we're at a good starting point. Dr. R.J. Rushdoony, in speaking of the issue of Greek philosophy, says this: it is in philosophy, however, that the Hellenic mind and Hellas, this is what the Greeks called themselves. They didn't call themselves Greek. They were Hellenists. They were part of Hellas. It is in philosophy, however, that the Hellenic mind exercised its greatest influence on the West. The Greek perspective can be summed up in the expression, man is the measure. The biblical answer would be, God is the measure. These two polar opinions form the antithesis of Western culture. Two positions ever at war one with another. Many other influences are present in Western culture, but they are mediated through one or another framework, notably the Hellenic. Even Christianity has been extensively influenced by Hellenic thought, so that much of church history is more Hellenic than biblical. And if you really want to just step outside of the last 2,000 years, and you want the big picture, and you want the grid to look and say, how do I evaluate the rise of nations, the fall of nations, the rise of philosophers, you can trace it and the excellency of the position of the church at any point in time to whether or not it represented Hellenic thinking or whether it represented Hebraic, and by Hebraic I mean biblical Christian thinking in its full form. And that has been the tension. It was the tension at the time of the Enlightenment. It was the tension at the time of the Reformation. It was the tension when Sir Thomas Aquinas, where Thomas Aquinas introduced his theory of man, in which he borrowed directly from Aristotle. And because he had to idealize the Aristotelian view of the mind, Thomas Aquinas concluded that while the effect of the curse was such that man's body was affected and his spirit was affected, or his spirit specifically, his mind was not affected. And so because the mind of man was not affected by the fall, Thomas Aquinas argued, we could reason truth apart from divine revelation. And Aquinas is really the starting point for the origins of problematic apologetics because of his wrong view of the fall, his wrong view of the mind, where the Scripture says, "The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, neither can he know them. They are foolishness unto them, being spiritually discerned." And so Aquinas did not fully recognize the concept of the natural man with his fallen mind, and he did not because he had greater adherence to Aristotle and to the Greek theologians and philosophers than he did to the integrity of the Word of God itself. And this is the great battle that's been with us. So some of the themes that I'm going to directly and indirectly mention, and I've already done some of this over the course of the next 35 minutes or so, is a historical overview of Greece and how these themes rise and how they fall, a look at the Greek philosophy, which we've already begun to do, mentioning some of the primary philosophers, specifically Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, although there are many others, Epicureans, many other different groups that rose and fall, Stoics, etc., and a brief overview of Greek religion and myth. We'll continue to discuss the long-term influence on the West. I'll point out to you the place of Greek evolutionism, especially as it relates to the concept of the Superman, Greek art and culture, the gymnasium, the academy, democracy, and then ultimately the problem of Hebrew syncretism, which was absolutely reaching its zenith at the time that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ came to earth at the Incarnation. In fact, remarkably, when Christ came, we are told in the Scriptures, in the last verse of the Old Testament, by implication, that there is a colossal crisis and a breakdown that's taken place in families, where fathers' hearts are turned away from their children and children are turned away from their fathers. This is at the high point of the Hellenistic influence on Jewish culture. And what is the response? The response is that when John the Baptist comes, heralding the coming of Jesus Christ, fathers' hearts will be turned to their children and children to their parents. But what do we know about the relationships of fathers and sons in the century preceding the coming of Christ? This was the time, historians tell us, that the Hebrews took their boys out of their homes and put them in the academies. It's when they sent their sons out of the household and adopted the Hellenistic method of training them in direct opposition to the Hebraic method of training them. And now let's make a brief comment about the Hebraic worldview and the Hebraic method of training. Under the biblical ancient pattern, which we see modeled for us through the patriarchal line of succession, which we see officially and formally exhorted to us in such grand passages as Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 32, we see an economy, a life, which is very much familistic as opposed to individualistic. The Greek will be individualistic and statist. The Hebrew is familistic. And what do we mean by a familistic society? We mean one in which the family is a centerpiece of economy. The family is a centerpiece of industry. In other words, the family is a place of production and commerce, not simply of consumption. We look to the family as a place of worship. Not that the family supplanted the temple, but the family was a daily place for catechizing children, which we see in the discussions when we read about the very exodus of the children of Israel and the questions that are asked to fathers. We see the family as a place where worship takes place, as again, not to supplant the temple, but the families would regularly come and worship God. And so the household was the incubator of righteousness. And the essence of the training program was one which pointed back to the basic battle found in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, 2, and 3. What was that battle? That ancient battle was a battle over relationships versus efficiency in the context of educational forms. How do we know that? We know that because in the book of Genesis, there is a question. How will man grow in wisdom and knowledge? How will he grow in understanding? God wanted a relationship. He wanted Adam to walk with him and to learn from him. He was the direct oracle communicating with Adam himself. And yet there was a temptation in the garden, a temptation that dealt with education. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if Adam was to taste of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he would be like God, and in the day he did, he would surely die. And so the serpent's great temptation was, forget the relationship, forget God's time frame for learning, and you follow the efficiency-based model of doing it your way so that you can know all things and your mind can be open up to think great thoughts after yourself. This is the essence of Greek thinking. And so Greek thinking does not find its origins ultimately in Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, but it finds its origin in the garden, with the battle between the serpent and between man, with the battle over relationships versus efficiency, with the battle over autonomy and man as the measure of all things versus God being the measure of all things. This is where it starts. Other elements of Hebrew society that we understand is the fact that the Hebrews worshipped one true God, that this God was transcendent, meaning that he was over his creation, whereas under the Greek worldview, gods were not transcendent, but they were immanent, meaning they were right here. And under the biblical system, our God is both transcendent and he's immanent. He's over and beyond creation, but he's also right here with us as well. But in the Greek model, the gods were, as I mentioned before, essentially divinized men. They had limitations. They could be controlled. They were not omnipotent. They were not omniscient. And much of Greek mythology and Greek religion is the story of these titan-like creatures, and some were actually called titans, these god-like creatures that controlled many things, but even Zeus himself ultimately being partially man, and various demigods and creatures being half man, half god, and no god being ultimate, no god being in control, no god being the supreme authority, and various battles going back and forth between gods. Many people believe that this points back to the Zoroastrianism of the ancient empires, in which we see similar concepts in the yin and yang of Eastern philosophy today, where you have gods battling it out with part good and part bad, and they all fight it out to try to bring a harmonious order between the good and the bad within the cosmos itself. And so the Hebrews are very, very different. They're familistic, they're relationship-driven in their educational methodologies. They believe that the voice of authority comes from God himself and not from man, and that God is the measure of all things. And consequently, their emphasis is on the revelation of God. And so one key difference within the life of the Hebrews, we'll see in the life of the Greeks, is that under the Hebrew training methodology, the emphasis is not on the body, in the sense that we worship the body, but there is an appreciation of the body as being made in the image of God. The emphasis is on work, and the emphasis is on dominion, where we will see within the Greek system, the emphasis is on philosophy, and the emphasis is on the flesh. And those two things are in constant tension one with another, flesh and philosophy. And you see that battle between the Stoics and the Epicureans, people going from one side to the other side, and some of the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato trying to reconcile the tensions between these diverse theories of the flesh or the mind, and bringing these different points together. Now, if we wanted to break down the religious worldview of the Greeks, and just be very simple here, make it as simple as we possibly can, I'm going to give you three basic categories to think about in reducing their religious worldview, and just make it very simple for you. The first one is statism. Now, under the statist philosophy of the Greeks, the state ultimately is supreme, the state ultimately has authority, the state ultimately is over man. The second thing that we'll mention in the religious worldview is the importance of civic virtue. This is something we'll see also in Rome. So the right people, the pious individuals, are the people that are in submission to the supreme. The great state, those are the ones that, as in Roman society, will be very important. And then, of course, humanism, or the worship of man. This is the ideal that man, as I said before, is the measure of all things. I would also point out that in light of statism, light of civil virtue, and in light of the humanism which the Greeks and later the Romans would embrace, we can understand why the highest ideal to which a man could aspire was not necessarily political life in ancient Greece, but was to become the role of the superhero. And who was the superhero? He was someone that rose and reached such acclaim through his physical activities, through his body itself, through the way he carried himself, through victories that he won, that he reached the status of being a demigod, and he was treated as a demigod. It's not accidental, I would point out, that Alexander the Great wanted himself to be declared by the oracle, and was declared by the oracle, to be a son of the gods, because he wanted to be perceived, and he viewed himself, as time went by, and actually believed himself to be actually a god. Well, the death of this young homosexual leader who conquered the entire world in his early 30s was clear evidence of the fact that he was not a god. And yet, even within the Greek system, since you could kill these godlike men, some people continued to view him and to think of him as this godlike creature. And he set up shrines, and he set up temples to himself, not necessarily to worship himself, but great big altars erected in his name all over the world that he was intent on conquering. Now, these ideals that we're speaking of, the ideals which served to undergird this religious worldview and philosophy, manifested themselves in several different ways. And we speak of an ideal, we speak of a concept that was set before society, that we would say, now, this is something that society esteems highly, and that we seek to maximize. And what did they include? Well, one was the worship of the body. Now, we see the worship of the body in the Greek games. We see it in their sculpture. We see it in their gymnasium, of which I'll speak more very shortly. And the worship of the body was central to understanding Greek culture. And so the hero, the Superman, this concept that would later be adopted by Nietzsche and put into place by Adolf Hitler, the Superman reflected an evolutionary concept. And the Greeks did believe in evolution long before Charles Darwin. And their evolutionary concept was that man would eventually evolve, and he would move to higher standards of perfection. And so those that reached greater perfections in body and in form and in capabilities, they were the supermen to which society was moving towards. And they were the ones that needed to be lauded and praised and set before others. And this is the reason why the education was done in the nude, the sports were done in the nude, and fighting was largely done in the nude. In fact, nakedness and nudity is absolutely central to Greek culture. As some of you may know, the Olympics were fought completely in the buff. No one was allowed to wear a shred of clothing when they came in, except insofar as occasionally they would have a helmet or something like that, but they were naked. And I don't have slides that I can put up for you of Greek sculpture, because they are all pornographic in nature, except maybe I clipped a little something here, you see a little head there. But pornography and nakedness is essential to understanding Greek thinking because of the ideals to which they held. And another thing, of course, was worship of youth. Because the young man, the strong man, this is the man that will lead our society into new opportunities, new growth. The worship of the individual was also something which was very, very powerful at this time. The individual who stood in opposition to the family, I would point out, separate, who could be transformed by the state, as Plato will speak of. And then, of course, the state itself. And I'll give you a quote from Plato in just a minute. The superhero. And this is why athletics played such a very, very important role in society. It's also the reason why moral perversion is at an absolute premium in ancient Greece. Now, folks, I'm just going to make a comment here if I can. It is simply dumbfounding to me, that Christians look back on men that were pedophiles and sodomites and look to them as the font of wisdom and understanding to lead us philosophically. Much of modern Roman Catholicism is syncretism between Greco-Roman ideals and biblical Christianity. Much Enlightenment thinking is the deification or the resurrection of these ancient, morally perverse concepts. And so it's not surprising when men like Michelangelo, who was a homosexual, and who desired to take the mission which was given him to make David and to do these wonderful art forms for the Pope, it's not surprising that Michelangelo looked back to the Greeks and he said, these are the men that set the standard. I will take this Christian theme and I will use the Greek form and I will bring them together. And in bringing the Greek form and the Christian ideal, we will truly, truly be able to express man at his very, very best. And so what do we see in Michelangelo's David? we see a young boy presented in a homoerotic fashion, naked, with bodily perfection, as he is about to stand before Goliath. This is certainly not representative of the biblical form. And as Christians, when we look at these sorts of art forms, you need to understand, oh, technically magnificent. In fact, maybe no one has ever, except for Michelangelo and a couple of others, reached the height of the Greek forms, which were simply remarkable for their technical excellence. In the same way that modern Hollywood presents things remarkably in terms of their technical excellence, and yet they are morally bankrupt because they come from a religious philosophy which centers around the worship of man. All of these different concepts, and I've already pointed to the dualistic problem that they have. Well, here's the Greek Empire, the classical Greek Empire that we're speaking, and the Athenian Empire about 450 BC. And you can see it touched an awful lot of the world there, and it spread, and it would change shapes and forms at different times and different places, but that gives you kind of a sense from Mysia, all these different areas that center around the Aegean Sea there, which are going to touch and be part of the Greek Empire at that particular time. And you'll note that Alexander, and I realize it may be a little difficult to see the map up there, Alexander does what no one really has truly done up to that point in time, and Alexander is able to travel really to the whole world. He goes all the way to India with his conquests, and he subjugates all those that stand in his way. He is not called Alexander the Great for nothing, and I'll mention a little bit more about him later on. But one of the most remarkable, amazing military leaders with a sense of personal divinity that he believed he had, and also, again, a morally perverse man who is the son of an abominably perverse father, Philip of Macedon. Well, if we're going to divide Greece into different time periods so you can have a grid, I'm going to break it up into a couple of different sections for you. And I'm trying to keep this very simple and easy to follow as best as I can. And we'll start off by looking at the early period of Greece, which is often called the trustee period, which begins in the 14th century BC and goes all the way up to the 9th century. Now, the difference between the trustee period and everything else that follows is that many of the caricatures that I've just shared with you do not apply in this time period. This particular time period was very familistic, largely speaking, in its orientation. Men worked around their families, individual families developed wealth, children, families were educated with the help of tutors and others around the home. And this particular time period was a time of great prosperity for the Greeks and growth for the Greeks. This trustee time period was to be supplanted, however, as commerce ultimately led to greater prosperity and the development of city-states and of the polis began to grow. Men congregated together and cities began to develop, and what would later become the ideal of Athenian and Greek democracy would ultimately emerge. And this would take place during this next time period. Let me move back a little and move forward a little, and we'll talk about Troy all the way to Alexander. When you think of the siege of Troy and the famous story of the Trojan horse, we're talking approximately 1200 BC. And the rise of the polis, which is at the end of the trustee period, which is the Greek city-state, which many of us look, myself not included, look back to as the birthplace of modern democracy and all of its glories. And then 776 BC, we see the first Olympics would take place. And isn't it amazing that here we are, thousands of years later, still celebrating and enjoying Olympics? 680 BC is when Homer's Odyssey would come out. And you know, it's interesting. It's very, very interesting. When you look at Homer's Odyssey, for all of its strengths and weaknesses, I want to say something positive about the Odyssey. At the heart of the Odyssey is a very interesting story that really is reflective of the old ideals, even though this is taking place in 680 BC, probably, we think somewhere around there. And these include a man's extraordinary love for his wife, for his child, his long and perilous return to reclaim his position as a husband and a father. And just as Helen's unfaithfulness had precipitated the Battle of Troy, so in the case of Homer and the Odyssey here, which of course is written after the Iliad, Penelope's fidelity to her husband makes Odysseus' homeward journey worthwhile. And so there is this emphasis on an ideal which really is pre-Plato. It's pre-Republic. This particular ideal says a man's family is worth fighting for. His wife and her virtue is something which is very, very important. And a man must be willing to do whatever is necessary to defend and protect the virtue of his wife and return to her. So you don't often hear me saying very kind things about the Greeks, but I do want to point out as a juxtaposition that we hear less and less of that as time goes on, because we're moving away from the historic familistic model, and more we're moving towards the individualistic philosophy, as we'll see as time presses on. You've heard of the word draconian expression. Draco's laws of Athens are about 620 BC. The great Battle of Marathon, of which I believe Bill Potter will be addressing that in his messages. And then, this is an incredible battle. The Sea Battle of Salamis takes place in 480 BC. And these are the wars of Sparta and Athens that are going on in 461 BC. Part 1 and Part 2, they take place over this rather lengthy, better part of a century. War 1 and War 2 takes place. And then all the way by 331 BC is really the rise of what we're going to think of as classical Greece, and that takes place with the historic conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. And taking you up further here, we'll move back a little bit and now take a minute to talk about the historical perspective on the rise and fall of what we call classical Greece, and then later the Hellenistic time period. The classical element of Greece really begins about 500 BC. That's the point that most historians look to. And if you go back just a few years, you'll see that Cyrus, the famous Cyrus, the great leader Cyrus, has founded Persia in about 559 BC. And after about 150 years or so, this is when Socrates is put on trial and when he takes his hemlock and when he'll die. Alexander conquers the Persian Empire in 331 BC, and he ultimately will die. You know what? I'm not sure if I'm correct about the age 33 there. Someone might be able to help me out that. But he dies in his early 30s in 323 BC. And we have the remarkable persecution of the Jews by Antiochus Epiphanes, which takes place in 174 BC. And just a quick comment I can about Antiochus Epiphanes, because he is a scoundrel of the first order. He lives between this particular time, 174 to 164 BC. This is when Judah is brought under the tyranny of this leader. They destroy Jerusalem, they defile the temple, and notably, Antiochus Epiphanes seeks to destroy every single copy of the Old Testament that he can find. Every single one. And the owners with the copies. But this is part of God's providence. As often happens, persecution leads to revival. Persecution leads to the response. And from the depths of the persecution, from the blood of the martyrs, we have the seed of the church. And so too, in the case of the Jews at this point in time, the tremendous persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is just outrageous, results in the wild revolt, which is a story in and of itself, of the Maccabean clan. And ultimately, we will see the gaining of independence for Judea. And this, of course, is going to be preliminary to the coming of Christ, and will play a very important role in that early development. When we speak of the classical period, with the death of Socrates here, it's important to point out to you that it was in 387 that the academy was founded. Now, when the Greek philosophers said we need to put this academy together, the idea here was that we will create a school system, an approach of mentoring, of philosophers mentoring these young men. And this will be central to raising up the great philosophical leaders. You know, the Academy of Greece continued for a very long time until it was officially abolished by Justinian. Somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd century, later on, Justinian abolished it because he saw it as the perpetuation of Greek philosophy and the enemy of Christianity. We have the death of Plato in 347 BC, and Jews now under the Greek rule in 333 BC, and then there is Alexander the Great. Now here's what I want you to notice as you look at these different dates and these different men. These men shaped Western civilization. They affected us for good and for evil. Their influence has been far-reaching, and they knew each other. Their lives overlapped. They studied together. And if I could just step out of our discussion on Greece and Jerusalem for just a moment, I'd like to point out that it has always been true historically. It's always been true that great revolutions and great movements, both for good and for evil, follow great men who live near each other, who know each other, who study under each other, who develop relationships with one another. I think of the founding of the United States of America. And I think of the fact that these men, the Virginians, for example, you're here in Virginia, that Mason knew Washington, and Washington knew Henry, and Henry knew Jefferson. These men all knew each other, and they had their lives overlapped. There was a tremendous amount of great thinking, great discussions that were taking place that gave birth to that remarkable generation. Well, the Greeks had their own version of this between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And so this man that would transform the world and change the world through his conquest is studying, thanks to the direction of Philip of Macedon, his father, under the great philosophers of his own day. And you have just this little tiny incubator of thinking, of philosophy, which is then going to affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Simply incredible, the far-reaching influence that will come from all of this. Alexander ultimately dies, and then Aristotle will die the very next year in 322 BC. Now, speaking of democracy, which is considered to be the great ideal of the Greeks, this is a wonderful point of contrast between Jerusalem and Athens. Because the Jerusalem system, what I'm just loosely calling the Hebraic understanding of life, was one in which God had essentially established a form of republic before the people demanded their king. And this republic, this concept of being ruled by elders who are representative leaders, is really essential to understanding the age-long battle of law and liberty, and of course the United States of America itself. We have a message here this week called the Hebrew Republic. And America was often likened to the Hebrew Republic during our early founding days. And that concept of a republic is very different from a democracy. Our founding fathers largely hated democracy. They saw it as an incredible evil. They spoke out against it. We had a democratic republic, which is very different from a pure democracy. And the Athenian experiments in democracy were failures for many, many different reasons. And they were, in fact, forms of mobocracy and the tyranny of the majority over individuals. Hence the death of many of the philosophers and the expulsion through ostracism of many of the great men that were part of that civilization and time. In fact, you had the ability to come together and basically on a whim, with a vote of a certain number of people, simply expel others from your town, not on the basis of a crime, but on the basis of the fact that you didn't like them. Because, of course, the will of the majority had to govern. As Christians, we need to always realize that mobocracy, democracy, the will of the majority is absolutely contra to the biblical method of decision-making and totally foreign, completely foreign to biblical concepts of law and justice. So be very careful with this word, which is largely touted. And when people say we need to spread democracy around the world, I shake in my boots. I shake in my boots. It's like saying we want to spread hell around the world. We want to spread chaos around the world. R.J. Rushdoony said this: much is said about the gift of democracy to the West from ancient Greece. The evidence is clear that democracy was not favored by most, nor was it characteristic of Greek society, where tyranny was more common than liberty. The rule of law, which characterized Medo-Persian, of course you know the laws of the Medes and the Persians, was in no sense a Hellenic way of life. Athens, supposedly the most enlightened, had a custom called ostracism, whereby any public man could be banished by vote for 10 years, later reduced to 5. Now, I'm going to move on for time's sake, and I'd like to make a comment about some of the other different Greek art forms. It's very important that we as Christians stop and we presuppositionally evaluate the various art forms that are around us. And we ask ourselves a question: is this art form one which is rooted in biblical thinking? I mean, this is what the Reformation did for us. It challenged us to go back to basics. And the Reformers themselves said, semper reformandum. We have to constantly be reforming our thinking, constantly be asking ourselves, is our thinking consistent with our presuppositions? Are we being epistemologically self-conscious about what we do and what we believe? Rushdoony challenges us here to examine even the foundations of the Greek tragedy, which he argues is contrary to biblical Christianity. And I quote Dr. Rushdoony when he said, "Tragedy is not a Christian form of literature. Rather, it is pagan. And sometimes in modern forms, it is very anti-Christian. Tragedy assumes that the universe is hostile to man. It does not see man as a sinner, nor the universe as God created and God ruled. Instead, it sees man as a victim. The chorus in Sophocles' Oedipus the King declares, Alas, ye generations of men, how mere a shadow do I count your life. Where is the mortal who wins more of happiness than the just, the seeming, and after the semblance of falling away? Thine is a fate that warns me, thine, unhappy Oedipus, to call no earthly creature blessed. This tragic view of life, Rushdoony writes, precedes the breakdown of culture because it encourages the belief that life is perverse and hopeless. Modern stage plays, movies, television, and novels are much given to presenting tragedies and teaching an anti-Christian religion thereby. Life is presented as meaningless or perverse. Man does not have a chance, nor is it his fault that he fails. And I think all of us, we should have a little chorus within our heart saying, yes, that's true, I've seen that. And I would also point out that this concept of fate and fatalistic determinism is ultimately completely at odds with biblical Christianity. Here, fate teaches that everything inevitably happens because of an uncontrollable necessity in nature, not because things are decreed by a personal God, but because simply that's the way it is. We are pawns in the universe. This is in direct contradiction to biblical historiography. It's in direct contradiction to the doctrine of providence. And so here again, in the battle between Jerusalem and Athens, fatalism versus providence, a completely different philosophy. And while the ancient Jews and the Hebrews may not have used the word providence, that concept, the theology of providence, was certainly very much part of their culture and of their thinking. And now, having looked at the stage plays and the concept of democracy, I want to bring you to Mr. Plato. Well, what do we have here? Here we have a man that has been raised as a font of wisdom from which we are to drink deeply in our democratic society. And who is this man? He is the enemy of the family. Who is this man? He is the enemy of God. And his philosophies are noxious, and they are the heart and soul of modern-day statism. What did Plato, this great philosopher leader, argue? What did he articulate in his Republic? Well, among other things, he helped to clarify, to quantify, and to cast the vision for the true modern belief that the child is the creature of the state, and the child exists for the purpose of the state. And the state declares what the child should believe, and how the child should be educated, and what the child should be done, and at all cost we need to get the child away from the parent, because the parent will infuse the child with philosophies that are in direct contradiction to the goals of the state. Plato said this in his Republic: they, referring to the philosopher kings, will begin by sending out into the country all the inhabitants of the city who are more than 10 years old, and they will take possession of their children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. I mean in the laws which we have given them. And in this way, the state and constitution of which we are speaking will soonest and most easily obtain happiness, and the nation has shown a constitution will gain most. Dear friends, this is what you and I have fought against. It's what our friends have been fighting against. It's what our speakers here, from Dr. Paul Jelly up in New England with his great work, to the homeschoolers that are in this room here today, to men like Colonel Eidsmoe who've been writing for years about law and liberty. This is everything we're fighting against. This is what we oppose. This is what is despicable in the eyes, and should be in the eyes, of Christians who understand the antithesis between Jerusalem and Athens. And so now we can speak of the gymnasium, this icon of ancient Greek culture. And there is a picture of one of the old gymnasiums, which is preserved to this very day. And I want to point out to you that the word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means the place to be naked. This is where you go for your athletics. You go to the place to be naked. Why? Because you do everything naked. Because we are seeking bodily perfection. This is the antithesis of Hebrew culture. Not just in the nudity, which of course led to perversion and immoral activity, but in terms of the entire emphasis of segregating the children from the parents, taking their clothing off, training them in the following ways, to be one of the following three things, which was the goal of the gymnasium: to be soldiers of the state, philosopher kings who will lead the state, or athletes who will become the supermen of the state. And the state will guide them, and the state will lead them, and the state will train them to do these things. Polar opposite to the biblical ideal of the humble man before God, who is the dominion worker for God, who is raised up within the context of the family, who exists as a member of the church, as the church presses forward, and who acknowledges the limited jurisdiction of the state. Because under the Hebrew Republic and the Hebrew concept of the state, including the Mosaic Law, the state is limited in its function. The state is a restraint against evil. The state bears the sword. But the state is not a means of regeneration. It's not a means of salvation. The state is limited. And so there again is a radically different perspective between Hebraic biblical thinking and between Greco-Roman thinking. Well, when I consider the Greek hero, and I look around modern society, I realize something. Our modern day movies, from Superman to Spider-Man to you name it, are really just modern day forms of the Greek hero. Half God, half man, capable of doing all things, rising above the laws of nature, capable of fixing the universe and putting the imbalance back in order. That's the fascination with modern Superman. And these modern Supermen are simply revivals of ancient paganism. You know, that's why we should be very uncomfortable with a Marvel Comics book view of life. We should recognize there's nothing biblical about that, and fascination with that is also not biblical. Nor is it biblical for us to think of ourselves as wonderful little Harry Potters, zapping people with all sorts of supernatural power that helps us to put the universe back in order in the battle between the good warlocks and the bad warlocks. This, again, is an old Babylonian and Greek concept which has come back to haunt us in the modern world today. And this haunting is such that it plagued the people at the time that the book of Maccabees was written. In fact, the Hebrews, like us today, like Christians today, we love the gymnasium. We love it. We love our entertainment. I mean, we love it so much, we can taste it. We'd rather have that than be reading John Knox, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards. We'd rather just be titillating ourselves with all of these exciting, supernatural, supermen-type fantasy stories. And there is something wrong. There's something wrong with a Christianity that cares more about the fantasy realm than cares about the objective history that God has given us. Something's the matter. We need a little perspective, don't we? Because we're thinking more like Greeks than we are like Hebrews. The second book of Maccabees says, and to such a height, and Josephus, by the way, quotes this in speaking of the Hellenization of the Hebrews. He says, and to such a height did the passion for Greek fashions arise, and the influx of foreign customs, that the priest, these are the temple priests, were no longer interested in the services of the altar, but despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful displays held in the palaestra, that's the wrestling arena, after the quoit throwing had been announced, thus setting at naught what their fathers' honors and esteeming the glories of the Greeks above all else. There it is. There it is. You have in the second book of Maccabees our story. You have the story that I'm here to tell you today. The message, all in a nutshell, that we as Christians, like the dog to his vomit and the sow to her mire and the burnt fool's bandaged finger going wobbling back to the fire, there is a great temptation on the part of Hebrews and modern-day Christians to go back to the vomit of paganism, to go back and to love paganism, and to glorify paganism. And I see this in some of the schooling techniques that are even out there today, where Greco-Roman thinking is set before our children as something which is good. By the way, I have no objection. I'm teaching you Greek thinking today. You need to understand it like you need to understand Darwin. But don't take it into your bosom and rejoice in it as something which is virtuous and glorified. Recognize that it is a stench in the nostrils of God, and it's something that we stand against, as opposed to something that we embrace and say, isn't this wonderful, isn't this glorious? And this problem has been around from the beginning. The Apostle Paul resolved the issue forever. Forever and ever and ever, he resolved the issue. when he stood with those Greek philosophers at Mars Hill. And he did not seek to engage in philosophical dialogue with them. He proclaimed the truth of the Scriptures. This God, whom ye ignorantly worship, him I declare to you. For some time he's been patient with you. He's winked at these sins, but the day of judgment is coming. He's the creator of the heavens and earth, and he requires that all men bow down before him. Paul, who is intimately familiar with the philosophers of Greece, and who references them, and who quotes them, Epimenides, etc., he mentions them. Nonetheless, Paul the Apostle stands in opposition to them and apart from them, and he refutes them. Whoops. And so we must do what Paul the Apostle did. We must begin to evaluate the icons of our culture and to stand against them. All those that represent Greco-Roman pagan revivals. We need to realize that within Christendom today, within Christianity, within our churches today, Greek thinking is all over the place. We worship our youth. We worship the body. We worship the state. We give our children to the state for the state to raise our children. We are acting like modern-day Neoplatonists in the Church of Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to ask the question. I've already put it before you. And the question is this. What do redeemed Christians have to do with the philosophies of sodomite, pagan Greeks? What do we have to do with them except to critique them and to refute them? And we must stand with Paul the Apostle. We must stand with all throughout time, including this man. And I'd like to close by giving you this definitive refutation by Tertullian himself. And some of this, just bear with me as I read it. It may seem a little bit wordy, but I think we can discern what he's saying here. Tertullian, in his article, The Connection Between Deflections from Christian Faith and the Old Systems of Pagan Philosophy, rebukes the syncretist of his day. He says, these are the doctrines of men and of demons produced for itching ears of the spirit of this world's wisdom. This the Lord called foolishness, and chose the foolish things of the world to confound even philosophy itself. For philosophy it is which is the material of the world's wisdom, the rash interpreter of the nature and the dispensation of God. Indeed, heresies are themselves instigated by philosophy. And what Tertullian is rebuking is Greek philosophy and the Greek worship of philosophy. He says, from this source came the aeons, and I know not what infinite forms, and the trinity of man and the system of Valentinus, who is of Plato's school. From the same source came Marcion's better God. That's one of the great heresies of the New Testament church age, Marcionism. With all his tranquility. Then came the Stoics. Then again the opinion that the soul dies is held by the Epicureans, while the denial of the restoration of the body is taken from the aggregate school of all the philosophers. Also, when the matter is made equal to God, then you have the teaching of Zeno. And when any doctrine is alleged touching a god of fire, then Heraclitus comes into play. Unhappy Aristotle, who invented for these men dialectics, the art of building up and pulling down, an art so evasive in its proposition, so far-fetched in its conjectures, so harsh in its arguments, so productive of contentions, embarrassing even to itself, retracting everything, and really teaching nothing. Whence spring those fables and endless genealogies, and unprofitable questions, and words which spread like a cancer? From all of these, when the apostle would restrain us, he expressly names philosophy as that which he would have us be on our guard against. Writing to the Colossians, he says, see that no man beguile you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, and contrary to the wisdom of the Holy Ghost. He had been at Athens, and had in his interviews with its philosophers become acquainted with that human wisdom which pretends to know the truth, while it only corrupts it, and is itself divided into its own manifold heresies by the variety of its mutually repugnant sects. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who had himself taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart. Away with all attempts to produce a modeled Christianity of Stoics, Platonic, and dialectical composition. We want no curious disputations after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. with our faith, we desire no further belief, for this is our primary faith, that there is nothing which we ought to believe besides the gospel. What a profound statement from our church father. And with that, we conclude our discussion of the antithesis between Jerusalem and Athens. I thank you.